close your eyes for a second. Now try to imagine tomorrow without using words. Try to plan what you'll do next week without sentences. Try to remember your childhood without the ability to tell yourself the story of what happened. You can't, can you? It's literally impossible. Your thoughts are language. Your memories are narratives. Your sense of self, that voice in your head that never shuts up, that is you talking to yourself. Now imagine living without any of that. No inner voice. No ability to think about the future beyond maybe a few hours. No capacity to share what you've learned except through direct demonstration. No stories. No myths. No ability to describe something that isn't right in front of you. That was the world our ancestors lived in for hundreds of thousands of years. Anatomically, they looked just like us. Same size brains, same vocal cords, same hands capable of incredible precision. But mentally, they were living in a kind of eternal present, a world of immediate sensation and reaction. And then, 50,000 years ago, something exploded. If you're using this to fall asleep or just curious about how we became human, subscribe maybe and tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I check comments and it's genuinely mind-blowing. Tokyo at sunrise, London at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, all connected by the very thing we're about to explore. Language, the bridge that connects every human mind across space and time. Today we communicate instantly with billions of people. We share ideas, jokes, scientific discoveries, cat videos. We take this so completely for granted that we forget how insane it actually is. You're reading symbols on a screen right now, symbols I created days or weeks ago, and somehow my thoughts are appearing in your head. That's not normal. That's magic. And it all started 50,000 years ago with the most important revolution in human history. Not the agricultural revolution, not the industrial revolution, the cognitive revolution, the moment human minds woke up. Here's what makes this mystery so fascinating. Humans had existed for 200,000 years before this moment. We'd survived ice ages, migration across continents, encounters with other human species like Neanderthals. We made tools, controlled fire, hunted cooperatively. We were successful, but we weren't special. Then suddenly, simultaneously, all over the world, humans just exploded with creativity. In caves in Spain and France, people started painting. Not simple scratches, elaborate art, animals in motion, handprints, abstract symbols that clearly meant something to the people who made them. In Africa, humans began creating complex compound tools, weapons with multiple parts that required planning days in advance to construct. In the Middle East, people started burying their dead with ceremony, placing flowers in graves, including tools and ornaments as if the dead might need them in some other existence. That requires belief in things you can't see, concepts that don't physically exist, and the most shocking change, humans started moving, not just wandering to the next valley, migrating across entire continents. Crossing into Australia 50,000 years ago required building boats and navigating open ocean to land you couldn't see from shore. Think about that. You have to convince a group of people to get into a wooden craft and paddle toward the horizon, toward nothing, based on nothing but your ability to describe a place that might exist. That's not just language. That's persuasion. That's abstract reasoning. That's belief in possibility. Before 50,000 years ago, you could count the number of tools humans made on your fingers. Stone hand axes, scrapers, maybe some wooden spears. Simple tools that hadn't changed design in hundreds of thousands of years. After 50,000 years ago, explosion. Needles for sewing. Fishing hooks. spear throwers that triple your hunting range, specialized blades for specific tasks, jewelry, musical instruments. Humans went from making the same few tools for 100,000 years to inventing something new every few generations. Scientists call this the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, but that name doesn't capture the magnitude of what happened. This wasn't a revolution. This was an awakening. Like someone had been walking around half asleep for 200,000 years and suddenly the lights came on. Consciousness itself seemed to transform from something private and locked inside individual skulls to something shared, something that could leap from mind to mind, something that could build on itself across generations. The question that's obsessed researchers for decades is simple. What happened? What changed inside the human brain or human culture 50,000 years ago that turned us from just another clever ape into the species that would eventually dominate the entire planet? The answer isn't simple. It never is with evolution. But at the center of every theory, underlying every explanation, is one thing: language. Not just the ability to make sounds and communicate basic ideas. Chimpanzees can do that, dolphins can do that, but real language. The kind that lets you describe things that don't exist, that lets you ask what if, that lets you plan tomorrow and remember yesterday with such clarity that the past and future become almost as real as the present. This is the story of how language didn't just change what humans could say, it changed what humans could think. And in changing what we could think, it changed everything. Picture this. It's 120,000 years ago. You're standing in East Africa, watching a group of humans move across the savannah. And here's what would blow your mind. They look exactly like you. Seriously, put one of them in modern clothes, give them a haircut and a shower, and they could walk down any street in any city today without anyone noticing. Same height, same bone structure, same brain size. Actually, their brains might be slightly larger than yours. If you measured their skulls, examined their skeletons, analysed their anatomy, you'd conclude these are modern humans, Homo sapiens, your people. But then you watch them for a day, a week, a year, and you start to notice something deeply, profoundly strange. They're not acting like modern humans, not even close. Their tools are simple, rocks chipped into basic shapes, hand axes that their ancestors were making 100,000 years earlier, using techniques that hadn't changed in millennia. They hunt, yes. They gather. Absolutely. They make fire, build simple shelters, care for their children. But there's something missing, something fundamental. They don't create art, they don't bury their dead with ceremony, they don't make jewelry or decorative objects, they don't seem to plan more than a few days ahead. And most tellingly, when they communicate with each other, it's basic. Grunts, gestures, maybe some simple vocalizations, warnings about predators, calls to share food, basic emotional expressions, but nothing complex, nothing abstract, nothing that even remotely resembles the language you're using to read this right now. This is the great paradox of human evolution, the mystery that has haunted anthropologists for decades. We had the hardware for modern behaviour for over 150,000 years before we actually started acting modern. The computer was built, fully functional, sitting there with all the right components, but the operating system hadn't been installed yet. And here's what makes this really mind-bending. These people had vocal cords identical to ours, the descended larynx that allows complex sound production. That's been around for at least 300,000 years, probably longer. They had the FOXP2 gene, the so-called language gene, in the same form we have it today. They had Broca's area and Wernicke's area, The brain regions associated with language production and comprehension, fully developed and sitting there in their skulls. Every piece of physical equipment needed for language was present and accounted for. But they weren't using it. Not really. Not the way we do. It's like they had a Ferrari engine but were only using it to power a bicycle. All that potential, all that capability, just sitting there dormant for millennia after millennia after millennia. The archaeological evidence for this cognitive stagnation is frankly depressing. Go to any early human site from 200,000 to about 70,000 years ago, and you'll find the same thing. Stone tools that vary slightly by region, but show almost no innovation over time. An archaeologist can look at a tool from 180,000 years ago and one from 100,000 years ago, and they'll be essentially identical. Same techniques, same designs, same limited toolkit. Generation after generation of humans, each with the same enormous brain, the same capable hands, the same survival challenges, and they're all making the exact same tools their great-great-great-grandparents made 50,000 years earlier. Think about that for a second. 50,000 years of cultural stagnation. For comparison, modern humans went from the invention of agriculture to landing on the moon in about 12,000 years. From the first stone buildings to skyscrapers in less than 10,000 years. From smoke signals to the internet in a couple of centuries. But these early humans, with brains identical to ours, went tens of thousands of years without any significant innovation at all. And it's not like they were stupid. The archaeological record shows they were perfectly capable of complex behavior when necessary. They were hunting large game animals, which requires planning and cooperation. They were using fire systematically, which demands understanding of cause and effect. They were surviving in diverse environments from tropical Africa to temperate Asia. They clearly had some form of communication, some way of sharing information and coordinating activities. But it was all concrete, all immediate, all tied to the here and now. Point at the antelope, grunt to indicate hunger, gesture to show where the good water source is, make a specific sound that means leopard nearby. This kind of communication can get you pretty far. Lots of animals have it. Vervet monkeys have different alarm calls for different predators. Eagles get one call, leopards get another, snakes get a third. The whole troop knows exactly what kind of danger they're facing based on the sound. Prairie dogs have alarm calls that apparently can describe the size, shape, and colour of approaching threats. Some researchers think they might even have something resembling rudimentary grammar. But here's what these communication systems can't do. They can't talk about things that aren't present. They can't discuss the past or plan for the future. They can't describe abstract concepts. They can't tell stories. They can't lie, speculate, or imagine. Every message is immediate, concrete, tied to something in the environment right now. And that's exactly what early human communication seems to have been like. Sophisticated enough to coordinate hunting and warn about dangers, complex enough to maintain social bonds and share basic information, but nowhere near the recursive, generative, infinitely flexible system we call language today. You could communicate danger, but you couldn't describe the time 3 years ago when a similar danger appeared and your group handled it a specific way. You could indicate a good hunting ground, but you couldn't explain the abstract principles of animal behavior that would help someone predict where game would be in new territory. You could express emotions, but you couldn't articulate complex internal states or discuss philosophical concepts. The neurological infrastructure was all there, sitting in those ancient skulls, waiting. But it wasn't switched on. Not fully. It's like having a high-performance computer with no software. or a concert piano that everyone's using as a table. All the potential is present, but something crucial is missing. Some catalyst, some trigger, some fundamental change that would take all that latent capability and activate it. And the really weird part, this wasn't just early Homo sapiens. Neanderthals had the same situation. They had large brains, actually larger than ours on average. They had the descended larynx, they had FOXP2 in the same form we do. Recent genetic analysis confirms they had the neural architecture for language. And yet, for hundreds of thousands of years, their cultural output was remarkably similar to early Homo sapiens. Basic stone tools, simple hunting strategies, minimal artistic expression, at least until very late in their existence. The few examples of Neanderthal art and symbolic behavior we've found all date to the last 50,000 years of their existence, right around the time they were encountering and possibly learning from modern humans who had already made the cognitive leap. This tells us something important. The capacity for language isn't just about having the right anatomy or even the right genes. You need those things, absolutely. But they're not sufficient by themselves. It's like having all the ingredients for a cake laid out on the counter: flour, eggs, sugar, butter, all there. But until you mix them in the right proportions, apply heat in the right way, follow the recipe precisely, you don't get cake. You just have a counter full of separate ingredients. For over 150,000 years, anatomically modern humans and Neanderthals coexisted with all the ingredients for language laid out in their brains. But the recipe hadn't been figured out yet. They were living in what we might call the silent world. Not literally silent, obviously. They made sounds, they communicated, they had social lives. But silent in the sense that the internal experience of these humans must have been fundamentally different from ours. No internal monologue narrating their experiences, no ability to rehearse future conversations or replay past ones in their heads. No capacity to think through complex problems by talking themselves through the steps. No way to imagine elaborate scenarios or construct detailed mental models of absent situations. Modern humans think in language. Even when we're not speaking out loud, there's usually a voice in our heads, a running commentary on our experiences, a way of using words to organize and make sense of the world. We use language to remember, to plan, to reason, to imagine. It's so fundamental to how our minds work that it's almost impossible to imagine thinking without it. But early humans did exactly that for tens of thousands of years. Their thinking was probably more visual, more spatial, more tied to immediate sensory experience, like how you might navigate a familiar route without conscious verbal thought, or how you might catch a thrown ball without calculating trajectories, or how you can recognize faces without being able to describe them precisely in words. That kind of nonverbal cognition is still present in us, running in the background, handling all sorts of complex tasks without language getting involved. For early humans, that might have been the only kind of cognition available: smart, capable, able to learn complex skills through observation and practice, but missing the linguistic layer that would eventually transform human consciousness into something unprecedented in evolutionary history. They could learn where good hunting was by following experienced hunters and watching what they did, but they couldn't sit around the fire afterward and discuss the abstract principles of animal behavior that would let them predict where to find game in entirely new territories. They could remember that eating certain plants made people sick, but they couldn't develop elaborate classification systems for plants or transmit detailed medical knowledge across generations. They could make effective tools by copying techniques they'd seen, but they couldn't innovate rapidly by describing new techniques verbally or combining ideas from multiple sources. Everything had to be learned through direct observation and hands-on practice. Knowledge transfer was slow, limited by what you could actually see and imitate. Innovation was incremental, constrained by what individuals could figure out through trial and error within their own lifetimes. Cultural evolution was glacial, because there was no efficient way to store and transmit complex information across generations and between groups. This explains the archaeological record perfectly. Those unchanging stone tools weren't evidence of stupidity. They were evidence of a pre-linguistic world where innovation was hard, transmission was limited, and cultural evolution moved at a crawl. A skilled toolmaker could create a perfect hand axe. They could teach others through demonstration. But they couldn't explain the principles, couldn't discuss variations, couldn't rapidly share innovations across large populations. So tool technology stayed locked in the same basic patterns for mind-boggling stretches of time. And then, somewhere around 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, something changed. Not everywhere at once, not in all populations simultaneously, but in some populations, probably in Africa, possibly in multiple locations, the switch flipped. The software got installed. The recipe came together. All that latent neural machinery that had been sitting dormant for 150,000 years suddenly activated. And when it did, when full recursive language emerged in human populations, it didn't just add a new skill to the human toolkit. It fundamentally transformed what it meant to be human. It changed how we think, how we remember, how we plan, how we imagine. It turned us from smart animals into something entirely new, something that could accumulate knowledge across generations, innovate at unprecedented speeds, and eventually build civilizations that would dominate the entire planet. But before we get to that explosion, we need to understand what triggered it. What changed? What was the catalyst that took all that existing neural machinery and finally activated it for full linguistic communication? Because here's the thing, the answer isn't simple. It wasn't one mutation, one invention, one brilliant innovation by one person. It was something more complex, more gradual, more contingent on circumstances than that. The story of how language exploded into human consciousness is a story about genetics, yes, but it's also about neuroscience, archaeology, population dynamics, and the strange feedback loops that happen when cultural evolution and biological evolution start reinforcing each other. It's about how small changes can cascade into revolutionary transformations when the conditions are exactly right. And 50,000 years ago, after over 150,000 years of waiting, the conditions finally became exactly right. The silent world was about to get very, very loud. Let's talk about the most controversial question in human evolution. What actually caused the language explosion 50,000 years ago? What biological change made it possible for humans to suddenly develop complex grammar, recursive thinking, and the ability to talk about things that didn't exist yet? For decades, scientists had theories but no hard evidence. Then in 2001, everything changed. A team of geneticists studying a British family with severe speech disorders discovered something extraordinary. They found a mutation in a single gene, FOXP2, that made it nearly impossible for affected family members to produce complex speech sounds or understand grammatical structures. This wasn't just a minor speech impediment. Members of this family, known in the scientific literature as the KE family, couldn't form sentences properly. They struggled with basic grammatical rules that 3-year-olds master easily. They had trouble coordinating the precise facial and tongue movements needed for clear speech. Most tellingly, they couldn't process language in real time. By the time they figured out what someone had said, the conversation had moved on. The researchers realized they had found something profound. A single gene that, when damaged, destroyed the ability to produce and process complex language. This meant FOXP2 wasn't just any gene. It was fundamental to the neural architecture that makes human language possible. But here's where it gets really interesting. When scientists sequenced the FOXP2 gene in other species, they found versions of it everywhere. Mice have FOXP2, birds have it, even fish have a version of this gene. It's ancient, probably over 100 million years old, conserved across vast spans of evolutionary time because it does something essential. In other animals, FOXP2 helps coordinate sequences of movements. It's involved in birdsong learning, in the way mice learn to produce specific vocalizations, in the motor control systems that let animals produce complex learned behaviors. But the human version is different. Our FOXP2 gene has 2 specific amino acid changes that appeared sometime in the last few 100,000 years. Just 2 substitutions out of 715 amino acids total. 2 tiny changes that rewired how our brains process sequential information. Think about what language actually requires at the neurological level. You need to coordinate dozens of muscles in your tongue, lips, jaw, and vocal cord with microsecond precision. You need to process incoming sounds, break them into meaningful units, map those units to concepts, all in real time while simultaneously planning your own response. You need to understand that word order matters, that the same words in different sequences mean completely different things. Dog bites man versus man bites dog. Same words, completely different meanings. This is what FOXP2 helps orchestrate. It doesn't create language by itself, but it's like a master conductor coordinating multiple brain regions that have to work together for language to function. The gene regulates the expression of dozens, maybe hundreds of other genes during brain development. When FOXP2 is working properly, it helps build the neural circuits that make language processing fast, automatic, and effortless. When those 2 amino acid changes appeared in the human version of FOXP2, something fundamental shifted. The gene started building neural circuits that were optimized not just for producing sounds, but for processing hierarchical grammatical structures, for handling recursion, the ability to embed ideas within ideas within ideas, for mapping sounds to meanings with the kind of precision and speed that human language requires. Now here's the really wild part. When scientists compared the FOXP2 gene across different human species, they found that Neanderthals had the same 2 amino acid changes we do. The Neanderthal version of FOXP2 is identical to the modern human version. This means the genetic mutation that enabled complex language didn't appear 50,000 years ago. It appeared much earlier, probably sometime between 400,000 and 600,000 years ago, before the split between modern humans and Neanderthals. This creates a massive problem for the simple genetic mutation theory. If Neanderthals had the language gene, why didn't they develop the explosive cultural complexity that modern humans did 50,000 years ago? Why don't we see evidence of Neanderthal art and symbolism until much later, and even then only sporadically, often in regions where they were in contact with modern humans? The answer is that genetics alone can't explain the language explosion. FOXP2 was necessary but not sufficient. It created the potential for complex language, but potential isn't the same as realization. It's like having all the components of a computer. The hardware is there, the circuits are ready, but until you install the right software and connect it to power, nothing happens. This is where the story gets more complicated and more interesting. FOXP2 wasn't working alone. Recent genetic studies have identified dozens of other genes involved in language processing. CNTNP2, which helps build the long-range connections between language areas in the brain. FOXP1, which works together with FOXP2 to regulate brain development. SRPX2, which is involved in the formation of the cortical circuits that process grammar. Each of these genes has its own evolutionary history. Some changed early in human evolution. Others changed more recently. What matters is when they all came together in the right configuration, when the full genetic toolkit for modern language was finally in place. And here's what the latest research suggests. That final assembly happened relatively recently, probably sometime between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago. Not one dramatic mutation, but the last pieces of a complex genetic puzzle falling into place. It's like watching a combination lock. Each number is necessary, but until you get the last one right, nothing opens. But even with all the genetic pieces in place, you still need the right trigger. This is what scientists call the switch hypothesis. The genetic capacity for language could exist for tens of thousands of years without being fully expressed, waiting for the right environmental and social conditions to flip the switch and turn potential into reality. Think of it like this. You can have a perfectly functional seed with all the genetic information needed to grow into a massive tree. But if you keep it in a drawer, nothing happens. You need the right soil, the right amount of water, the right temperature, the right timing. The genetic potential is meaningless without the right environment to activate it. For humans, that environment was social. Language is fundamentally a collective phenomenon. You can't have language alone. You need a community of speakers, a group large enough and interconnected enough to maintain and transmit linguistic complexity across generations. This is where the FOXP2 story connects back to the archaeological evidence. The gene created the neural hardware for language processing, but that hardware needed to be trained, shaped by intense social interaction from early childhood. Studies of the KE family showed that their FOXP2 mutation didn't just affect speech production, it affected their ability to learn from social interaction, to pick up the implicit rules of language that normal children absorb effortlessly. This suggests that FOXP2 and related genes don't just build language circuits, they build social learning circuits, neural systems that are specifically adapted to extract patterns from human social interaction. When these genes are working properly, children become sponges for linguistic information. They hear their parents talking and automatically start extracting grammatical rules, building mental dictionaries, learning the sound patterns of their native language. But this incredible learning ability only works in the right social environment. You need consistent exposure to complex language from caregivers. You need interaction with multiple speakers. You need a community where language is being used for sophisticated purposes, telling stories, planning future actions, explaining abstract concepts. The genetic changes made this kind of learning possible, but the social changes made it necessary. As human populations grew after the bottleneck, as trade networks expanded, as groups needed to coordinate increasingly complex activities, the selection pressure for better communication intensified. Individuals with slightly better language abilities had huge advantages. They could negotiate more effectively, teach more efficiently, learn more quickly from others. Over thousands of generations, this created a feedback loop between genes and culture. Better linguistic genes allowed more complex culture. More complex culture created stronger selection pressure for better linguistic genes. The ratchet effect, each generation building on the innovations of the previous one, made possible by genetic changes that improved the brain's ability to process and transmit information. The neuroscience of this process is fascinating. Brain imaging studies of people learning language show that FOXP2 is particularly active in the basal ganglia and cerebellum, deep brain structures involved in learning sequential patterns and automating complex behaviors. When you're first learning a language, speaking requires intense conscious effort. Every word, every grammatical structure requires deliberate thought. But as you practice, something remarkable happens. Those patterns get transferred to the basal ganglia, where they become automatic. FOXP2 seems to help orchestrate this transfer, building the neural circuits that make language processing fast and unconscious. Eventually you can speak without thinking about it, which frees up your conscious mind to think about what you're saying rather than how you're saying it. This automation is crucial for human language. We speak at about 150 words per minute, which means we're producing multiple syllables per second, coordinating dozens of muscles, selecting words from a mental dictionary of tens of thousands of options, applying grammatical rules, all automatically, all simultaneously. No other species can do this. No other species has the neural architecture to make this kind of processing possible. But the most important thing FOXP2 enabled wasn't just faster speech. It was recursive thinking, the ability to embed concepts within concepts infinitely. This is what linguist Noam Chomsky identified as the core of human language, what he called merge, the ability to take two ideas and combine them into a larger idea, then take that combined idea and merge it with another idea, building structures of unlimited complexity. The man who you saw yesterday, who was wearing the blue coat that he bought last week from the store that recently opened downtown, that's 4 levels of embedding, 4 recursive structures nested inside each other. We process sentences like this effortlessly, but the neural computation required is staggering. You have to keep multiple levels of structure active simultaneously, track relationships across long distances in the sentence, resolve ambiguities in real time. FOXP2 and related genes built brain circuits capable of this kind of computation. Not all at once, but gradually over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. Each small improvement in recursive processing ability would have provided advantages. Better planning, better social coordination, better teaching of complex skills. When scientists damaged FOXP2 in mice and studied what happened to their brains, they found disrupted connectivity between the cortex and the basal ganglia. The neural circuits that allow learning of complex sequences were malformed. The mice could learn simple patterns, but they struggled with anything that required hierarchical organization, with sequences embedded within sequences. This is exactly what you need for language. Not just the ability to produce sounds or to associate sounds with meanings, but the ability to organize those sounds into hierarchical structures, to build recursive patterns, to generate an infinite number of possible sentences from a finite set of rules. When the full genetic toolkit came together in humans, probably around 100,000, 200,000 years ago, it created brains capable of these computations. But capability isn't the same as use. You can build a supercomputer, but if nobody writes software for it, it just sits there. The genetic changes created the potential for language. The social and environmental changes of the last 50,000 years finally activated that potential fully, flipped the switch, turned on the machine. And once it was on, once complex language was being used regularly in human communities, there was no going back. The advantages were too overwhelming. Groups with sophisticated language could outcompete groups without it. The gene-culture feedback loop accelerated. Within just a few thousand years, language had transformed from a biological potential into a species-defining trait, the thing that made us fundamentally different from every other animal that had ever existed. But the genetic story is only part of the picture. To understand why the explosion happened when it did, we need to look at what was actually happening on the ground 50,000 years ago. We need to look at the archaeological evidence, at the physical artifacts that show exactly when and how human behavior changed. That's where the story gets really concrete, really undeniable. But here's where we need to stop and ask the question that changes everything. What actually happened 50,000 years ago? Not in terms of population spreading or species competing. We've covered that. The real question is, what changed inside the human mind that made modern humans so devastatingly effective? Because something did change. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming and impossible to ignore. Around 50,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years, the archaeological record explodes. Not gradually, not in a slow accumulation of improvements over hundreds of thousands of years. It explodes. Like someone flipped a switch in the human brain and suddenly everything was different. Archaeologists call it the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, and it represents one of the most dramatic behavioral shifts in the entire history of our species. Before 50,000 years ago, human sites are pretty boring. You find stone tools, yes. Evidence of fire, yes. Occasional processed animal bones showing butchery marks. Maybe some scrapers and choppers that vary in quality, but follow basic patterns that had been repeated for hundreds of thousands of years. Tools made by humans 200,000 years ago look remarkably similar to tools made 100,000 years ago, which look similar to tools made 60,000 years ago. Slow incremental improvements, but nothing revolutionary. Then suddenly, everything changes, and I mean everything. The first thing that appears is art, not just decoration, not just scratches on bones that might be accidental. Deliberate, sophisticated, unmistakably intentional art. Cave paintings that would make modern artists jealous. The most famous examples come from Europe. Lascaux in France, Altamira in Spain, Chauvet Cave with its stunning charcoal drawings of lions, rhinoceroses and mammoths. These aren't primitive stick figures. These are sophisticated representations showing perspective, shading, movement. The animals look alive, muscles tensed, heads turning. Whoever painted them understood anatomy, understood how light and shadow create depth, understood composition. But here's what's really incredible. These paintings appear suddenly in the archaeological record. We don't find crude attempts from 100,000 years ago slowly improving over time. We find nothing, nothing, nothing. Then suddenly, masterpieces. It's like watching a child who's never held a pencil suddenly produce a Rembrandt. The Chauvet Cave paintings are dated to about 36,000 years ago, and they're as sophisticated as anything painted 20,000 years later. There's no learning curve visible in the archaeological record. The skill appears fully formed, and it's not just cave paintings. Around the same time you start finding portable art. Small sculptures carved from ivory, bone or stone. The Venus figurines, small statues of women with exaggerated sexual characteristics, appear at sites from Spain to Siberia. Some are crude, some are remarkably detailed, but all of them represent something profound. They're abstract representations of the human form, stylized and symbolic rather than realistic. Making them requires the ability to hold an abstract concept in your mind a mental image of what you're trying to create, and then systematically work the material until the physical object matches the mental image. That's not instinct. That's not something you can stumble into by accident. That's cognitive planning requiring symbolic thought. Then there's jewellery. Beads made from shells, stones, and animal teeth start appearing at archaeological sites across Africa, Europe, and Asia. These beads would have taken hours to create. You have to find the right materials, drill holes through them without breaking them, string them in patterns. Why would anyone spend time doing this unless the object had meaning beyond its physical properties, unless it symbolized something? Status, group membership, spiritual beliefs, personal identity. Jewelry is pure symbolism. It has no survival value. You can't eat it, can't use it as a weapon, can't use it to build shelter. Its only purpose is to communicate information about the wearer to other humans. That requires shared symbolic understanding, the foundation of language. But it's not just art and decoration. Tool technology explodes too. Before 50,000 years ago, you find maybe a dozen distinct tool types in any given human population. Hand axes, scrapers, choppers, basic stuff that gets the job done but doesn't show much creativity. After 50,000 years ago, you find hundreds of specialized tool types, burins for engraving, microliths for composite tools, specialized scrapers for different materials, bone needles for sewing, harpoons for fishing, spear throwers for hunting. Each tool is designed for a specific purpose, and many require multiple steps to manufacture. You can't just pick up a rock and make a bone needle. You have to find the right bone, cut it to size, grind it smooth, drill a hole through one end without splitting it. That's a multi-step process requiring planning, patience, and technical knowledge. More importantly, these tools show standardization. An archaeologist can look at a spear point from southern France and another from northern Spain, made by different people who probably never met, and identify them as the same design. That's impossible without communication, without the ability to share detailed technical information between groups, to teach specific techniques, to maintain traditions across generations and geographic distances. Raw instinct doesn't produce standardization across hundreds of miles. Culture does, language does, and then there's the evidence of long-distance trade. Before 50,000 years ago, raw materials at archaeological sites are almost always local. If you find obsidian tools at a site, there's usually an obsidian source within a few days' walk. Makes sense. You use whatever materials are available nearby. But after 50,000 years ago, you start finding materials that came from hundreds of miles away. Shells from the Mediterranean showing up at sites in Central Europe, over 500 miles inland. Obsidian from sources in Turkey appearing at sites in Israel. Amber from the Baltic showing up in France. These aren't accidents. These aren't people randomly wandering across continents carrying rocks. These are trade networks, systematic exchanges of valuable materials between distant groups. Think about what trade requires. First, you need to recognize that someone else has something you want and you have something they want. That's abstract valuation. Second, you need to negotiate an exchange. Agree on terms, probably develop relationships of reciprocity and trust. Third, you need to maintain those relationships over time, because one-time exchanges don't create networks. Networks require repeated interactions, memory of past dealings, expectation of future cooperation. All of this is impossible without sophisticated communication. You can't negotiate a trade agreement with gestures and grunts. You need language, complex language capable of expressing abstract concepts like value, obligation, and future intention. The burial evidence from this period is equally stunning. Humans had been occasionally burying their dead before 50,000 years ago. Neanderthals did it. Even some earlier human populations showed signs of intentional burial, but after 50,000 years ago, burials become elaborate. Bodies are placed in specific positions, often flexed or extended in careful arrangements. They're covered with red ochre, a pigment that required effort to collect and process. Most tellingly, they're buried with grave goods. Tools, jewelry, weapons, food, sometimes even entire animal carcasses. The famous burial at Sungir in Russia, dated to about 34,000 years ago, contained 2 children buried head to head, covered in thousands of ivory beads that would have taken thousands of hours to manufacture. Someone invested enormous resources in burying these children properly. Why? Grave goods only make sense if you believe in some form of afterlife, some continued existence where the dead person might need or want these objects. That's abstract thinking on a level that requires language. You can't just instinctively believe in an afterlife. You have to conceptualize it, share that concept with others, develop communal beliefs about what happens after death. That requires storytelling, speculation, the ability to discuss things that can't be directly observed. That requires language sophisticated enough to handle hypotheticals and abstractions. And then there's music. Around 40,000 years ago, we start finding musical instruments, flutes made from bird bones and mammoth ivory, carefully carved with finger holes positioned to produce specific notes. The oldest confirmed musical instrument found in Germany is over 42,000 years old. It's made from a vulture's wing bone, hollowed out and drilled with 5 holes. Analysis shows it could produce a range of notes, probably part of a musical scale. Someone sat down and figured out where to place the holes to create harmonious sounds. That's mathematics and acoustics, even if they didn't have formal terms for those concepts. But music is more than just interesting technology. Music is fundamentally about communication, not practical communication about where the food is or what dangers to avoid. Music communicates emotions, tells stories, creates shared experiences that bind groups together. Every human culture ever studied has music. Every single one. It's universal because it serves a crucial social function. It allows groups to synchronize emotionally, to create shared identity, to pass down cultural knowledge through memorable forms. Music is cultural transmission, and cultural transmission requires language to develop and maintain. The really wild thing is how fast all of this happens. We're not talking about gradual changes over hundreds of thousands of years. From the first appearance of sophisticated art to fully developed trade networks and elaborate burial practices, you're looking at maybe 10,000 years. Maybe. Some researchers think it happened even faster, that the real explosion of behavioral modernity took only 2,000 or 3,000 years. That's nothing. That's maybe 100 generations. If you lined up everyone from the pre-explosion period to the post-explosion period, it would look like the children suddenly became geniuses compared to their parents. And it happened everywhere, not just in one region where some particularly innovative group stumbled onto new technologies. The Upper Paleolithic revolution shows up in Africa, Europe, Asia, even Australia, which modern humans reached around 50,000 years ago. The specific artifacts vary. African populations developed different tool traditions than European populations. Asian art styles differ from European ones, but the underlying pattern is the same everywhere. Sudden explosion of symbolic thinking, artistic expression, technological innovation, and social complexity. This geographic spread is crucial evidence. If only one population had shown these changes, you could argue they just got lucky, stumbled onto some useful innovations that gave them advantages. But when the same pattern appears simultaneously across multiple continents, among genetically connected but geographically isolated populations, you're looking at something fundamental, something that changed in the human mind itself, not just in specific cultures or regions. The most stunning example is probably the spread to Australia. Modern humans reached Australia at least 50,000 years ago, possibly earlier. Getting there required sophisticated maritime technology. You can't accidentally float to Australia. Even during periods of lower sea levels when land bridges connected some regions, getting from Southeast Asia to Australia required crossing at least 50 miles of open ocean. That means boats, real boats, designed and built for ocean crossings. It means navigation skills, the ability to plan multi-day journeys, probably the ability to predict weather patterns and ocean currents. Most importantly, it means communication. Building a seaworthy boat is not a one-person job. You need coordinated effort, shared knowledge, probably elaborate planning discussions about routes and resources and timing. The archaeological evidence from early Australian sites shows the same explosion of symbolic behaviour. Rock art, including some of the oldest known paintings in the world. Sophisticated tools adapted to Australian environments. Evidence of complex social structures capable of coordinating group activities. These humans arrived in Australia already carrying the full package of behavioural modernity. They didn't develop it gradually after arriving. They brought it with them, which means they had already undergone whatever cognitive transformation produced these capabilities before they ever left Asia. What makes all of this evidence so powerful is its consistency. You're not looking at isolated innovations that might be explained by luck or accident or individual genius. You're looking at a comprehensive transformation of human behavior affecting every aspect of life simultaneously. Art, technology, social structure, symbolic thinking, long-distance communication, all appearing together in the same narrow window of time. That's not coincidence. That's not gradual evolution. That's a phase transition, a fundamental reorganization of human cognitive capabilities. Something happened to the human brain around 50,000 years ago that unlocked potential that had been waiting, dormant, for tens of thousands of years. Because here's the really weird thing. Modern humans as a species are about 300,000 years old. The fossils prove it. Anatomically, modern humans with brains the same size as ours, bodies the same shape as ours, existed in Africa 300,000 years ago. But they weren't behaviourally modern. They had the hardware, the brain structure, the physical capacity for symbolic thinking. But they weren't using it. Not fully. Not in the ways we see exploding into the archaeological record after 50,000 years ago. For 250,000 years, anatomically modern humans existed without creating art, without developing complex technologies, without showing evidence of the symbolic thinking that defines our species today. Then suddenly they did. The software upgraded. The operating system came online. Whatever you want to call it, something changed that allowed humans to access cognitive capabilities they'd always had, but never fully utilized. And that change spread through human populations across 3 continents within a few thousand years, transforming every group it touched from anatomically modern humans into behaviorally modern humans. From humans with potential into humans who realized that potential and used it to dominate the planet. What was that change? What happened 50,000 years ago that flipped the switch? The archaeological evidence can only tell us that something changed. It can't tell us what. For that, we need to look deeper into genetics, into neuroscience, into the structure of the human brain itself. Because somewhere in there, in the firing of neurons and the expression of genes, lies the answer to the greatest mystery in human evolution, the moment minds woke up. But here's where the story gets really wild. Language didn't just give humans a better way to communicate, it physically restructured our brains, changed the actual architecture of our neural networks in ways that made us fundamentally different from every other species on the planet. We're not talking about minor tweaks. We're talking about a complete rewiring job that happened in real time as language evolved. A feedback loop where speaking made us smarter, which let us develop more complex language, which made us even smarter. Let's start with the obvious stuff, the hardware. Modern human brains have two regions that are absolutely essential for language, and that are either absent or dramatically underdeveloped in other primates: Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Broca's area sits in the left frontal lobe, right behind your temple. It's responsible for language production, the actual mechanics of speaking. When you form sentences, choose words, coordinate the complex muscular movements required to produce speech, that's Broca's area doing the heavy lifting. Wernicke's area is further back, in the left temporal lobe near your ear. This region handles language comprehension, understanding what words mean, how they relate to each other, what sentences are actually trying to convey. Now here's the thing, these areas exist in other primates. Sort of. Chimpanzees have regions that correspond roughly to Broca's and Wernicke's areas, but they're tiny, underdeveloped, barely functional compared to what humans have. The human versions are massively enlarged. Not just bigger, but connected to each other and to other brain regions through dense networks of neural pathways that simply don't exist in other species. It's like comparing a dirt road to an 8-lane superhighway. The basic concept is the same, but the scale and functionality are completely different. But wait, it gets weirder. These regions aren't just sitting there waiting to be used. They develop in response to language exposure. Brain imaging studies of children show that Broca's and Wernicke's areas literally grow as kids learn to speak. The neural connections multiply, the grey matter density increases, the white matter tracts that link these regions to the rest of the brain become more robust. This is neuroplasticity in action, the brain physically reshaping itself based on experience. And language is one of the most powerful neuroplastic forces we know of. Researchers have done studies on deaf children who weren't exposed to any language, spoken or signed, during their critical developmental years. Their Broca's and Wernicke's areas remain underdeveloped, smaller and less connected than in children who learned language normally. The hardware exists, but it needs the software of language to fully develop. Think about what this means. Language isn't just something our brains do, it's something that shapes our brains. Every conversation you have, every sentence you read, every word you speak is physically altering the structure of your neural networks. For our ancestors 50,000 years ago, this created an extraordinary feedback loop. As they developed more sophisticated language, their brains restructured to handle it better. As their brains improved, they could develop even more complex language. Generation after generation, the loop accelerated. But Broca's and Wernicke's areas are just the beginning. Language processing requires coordination across virtually the entire brain. Understanding a single complex sentence activates dozens of different neural networks simultaneously. Let me show you what I mean. Brain imaging studies using functional MRI scanners can watch the brain in real time as people process language. When researchers show subjects simple words like dog or tree, they see activation in Wernicke's area and some related regions. Pretty straightforward. But show those same subjects a complex sentence with subordinate clauses, metaphors and abstract concepts, and the whole brain lights up like a Christmas tree. Wernicke's area for comprehension, Broca's area for internal speech as you mentally rehearse the sentence, the prefrontal cortex for working memory, holding multiple concepts in mind simultaneously, the temporal lobes for semantic processing, accessing the meanings of individual words, the parietal regions for spatial reasoning when the sentence describes locations or movements, the limbic system for emotional content, the motor cortex when the sentence describes actions, even if you're not performing them. This is what makes human language unique. It's not just one brain region doing one thing. It's synchronized activity across multiple systems that normally handle completely different functions. Vision, motor control, emotion, memory, spatial reasoning, all recruited to process something as abstract as a sentence. No other animal does anything remotely like this. When a chimpanzee hears a vocalization from another chimp, maybe 2 or 3 brain regions light up. Simple recognition, basic emotional response, that's it. When a human processes language, we're running a full brain coordination task that would be impossible without massive neural reorganization. And here's the really crazy part. This coordination requires something called syntax, the rules for how words combine to create meaning. And syntax processing is one of the most computationally demanding things the human brain does. Consider this sentence. The dog that chased the cat that caught the mouse is sleeping. Not particularly complex by human standards. A 5-year-old could understand it. But parsing that sentence requires your brain to track multiple nested relationships simultaneously. Which dog? The one that chased the cat. Which cat? The one that caught the mouse. What's the dog doing? Sleeping. Not chasing sleeping. Your brain had to hold dog in working memory while processing 2 complete subordinate clauses before finally connecting it to the verb sleeping. Then it had to backtrack and reconstruct the entire relationship structure to extract the meaning. This recursive processing, the ability to embed concepts within concepts within concepts, appears to be unique to human language, and it requires unprecedented neural coordination. The prefrontal cortex has to maintain working memory. The temporal regions have to process individual word meanings. The parietal areas have to track the spatial and temporal relationships. And Broca's area has to coordinate the whole symphony, making sure all the pieces fit together correctly. Researchers have found that syntax processing creates gamma wave synchronization across the brain. Different regions start firing in coordinated rhythms, communicating with each other at high speeds to maintain the complex information processing required for understanding nested sentence structures. This kind of neural synchronization doesn't happen for other cognitive tasks. It's specifically a language thing, evidence that human brains developed entirely new coordination mechanisms to handle the computational demands of syntax. But the neural revolution didn't stop with processing individual sentences. Language enabled something even more profound. The ability to understand other minds. There's a system in the brain called the mirror neuron network. These are neurons that fire both when you perform an action and when you watch someone else perform that action. They were first discovered in macaque monkeys in the 1990s, and at first researchers thought they were just simple imitation circuits. Then they found mirror neurons in humans, and human mirror neurons are different. They don't just respond to actions, they respond to intentions. When you watch someone reach for a cup, your mirror neurons don't just simulate the reaching movement, They model why the person is reaching. Are they thirsty? Are they passing the cup to someone else? Are they about to throw it? And here's where language comes in. The human mirror neuron system is massively expanded compared to other primates, and it's directly connected to Broca's area, the language production center. This connection creates something extraordinary, the ability to model other people's thoughts through language. When someone tells you a story, your mirror neurons simulate not just the actions described, but the mental states of the people in the story. You're literally running a simulation of their minds in your own brain. This is why stories are so powerful, why we can read a novel about someone who lived 1,000 years ago and feel what they felt, understand what they thought. Our mirror neuron system, enhanced and coordinated by language networks, lets us experience other minds as if they were our own. For our ancestors developing language 50,000 years ago, this created unprecedented social abilities. You could explain not just what you did, but why you did it. Not just what you saw, but what you thought about what you saw. Not just where the good hunting grounds were, but how you figured out they were good. The social brain hypothesis suggests this is actually why language evolved in the first place. Not primarily for communication about the external world, but for managing increasingly complex social relationships. Here's the logic. As human groups grew larger during the post-bottleneck recovery period, social coordination became more challenging. In a group of 20 people, everyone knows everyone else. Social relationships are straightforward. You either trust someone or you don't. You cooperate with family and close allies. But in a group of 150 people, which seems to be about the limit of stable human social groups, you need to track dozens of complex relationships. Who's allied with whom? Who owes debts to whom? Who betrayed whom in the past? Which individuals are reliable cooperators and which are cheaters looking for opportunities to exploit others? Primates without language solve this problem through grooming. Chimpanzees spend hours each day physically grooming each other, maintaining social bonds through direct physical contact. But grooming doesn't scale. You can only groom one individual at a time, and there are only so many hours in the day. Language solves the scaling problem. You can maintain social bonds with multiple people simultaneously through group conversation. You can share information about third parties, spreading reputations and coordinating group responses to social violators. You can form alliances by talking about potential threats and opportunities. Most importantly, you can gossip. And gossip, as frivolous as it sounds, might be one of the primary evolutionary functions of language. The ability to share social information rapidly through a group, creating consensus about who's trustworthy and who's not, who deserves cooperation and who deserves punishment. Brain imaging studies show that social gossip, talking about other people's behavior and intentions, activates the mirror neuron system and language networks simultaneously. You're not just processing words, you're building mental models of social relationships, evaluating them against your own experiences, and updating your understanding of the social landscape. This is computationally intense. It requires your brain to maintain multiple perspectives simultaneously. What does person A think about person B? What does person B think about person C? What do I think about both of them? How will person A react if they find out what person B said? Should I tell them or keep it to myself? These kinds of recursive social calculations require exactly the kind of neural coordination that language networks provide. And the more complex your social environment, the more valuable these abilities become. For our ancestors 50,000 years ago, this created another feedback loop. More sophisticated language enabled more complex social organization. More complex social organization created selection pressure for even better language abilities. Groups with better communicators could maintain larger, more coordinated communities. Larger communities outcompeted smaller ones. Over thousands of generations, this pressure drove the continued evolution of language-specific brain structures. But the most profound effect of language on the brain was even more fundamental. Language changed how we think, created entirely new forms of cognition that were simply impossible before. Consider abstract concepts: justice, beauty, truth, freedom. These aren't things you can point to. They're not objects in the world. They're mental constructs that only exist because we have words for them. And once we have words, we can think about these concepts, refine them, debate them, build entire philosophical systems around them. Brain imaging studies show that processing abstract concepts activates different neural networks than processing concrete objects. When you think about a chair, your brain activates visual and spatial processing regions, essentially simulating what a chair looks like. When you think about justice, you're activating language networks, social cognition systems, emotional processing centers, all working together to construct meaning from something that has no physical form. Without language, these abstract thoughts are probably impossible. You can't think about justice without words because there's nothing concrete to think about. Language provides the scaffolding that lets us build mental structures representing purely abstract ideas. This is what some neuroscientists call the language-thought feedback loop. Language doesn't just express thoughts we already have, it enables new kinds of thinking. Once you have words for abstract concepts, you can manipulate those concepts mentally, combine them in new ways, build higher-order abstractions on top of them. Mathematics is the perfect example. Numbers are abstract concepts. You can't have 3 without a word or symbol representing the concept of threeness. But once you have that word, you can start building. 3 plus 3 equals 6. 6 is also 2 times 3. If you have 3 groups of 3, you have 9. Now you're doing multiplication. Once you have multiplication, you can develop exponents. Once you have exponents, you can develop calculus. Each step requires language or symbolic notation, which is just written language to hold the previous concepts in place while you build on top of them. Without language, you're stuck at the level of perceptual approximation. This pile is bigger than that pile. This might be enough to choose the bigger food source, but it's nowhere near enough to build mathematics. The same principle applies to planning. Non-linguistic animals can plan, sort of. A squirrel buries nuts for winter, but that's instinctive, hardwired behavior. A squirrel can't adjust its strategy based on predictions about how harsh this particular winter might be. Humans with language can engage in indefinitely extended hypothetical reasoning. If I plant crops here, and the rains come at the usual time, and no one steals the harvest, then I'll have food next winter. But if the rains are late, I should plant these other crops instead. And I should make alliances with neighbouring groups in case my crops fail, so I can trade for food. This kind of branching hypothetical thinking requires language to maintain multiple possible scenarios simultaneously. You're essentially running simulations in your head, and language provides the mental notation system that lets you keep track of which scenario is which. Brain imaging shows that this kind of planning activates the prefrontal cortex, the most recently evolved part of the human brain, along with language networks. You're literally using words to think through possibilities, and that linguistic scaffolding enables vastly more sophisticated planning than any non-linguistic creature can achieve. For our ancestors 50,000 years ago, these new cognitive abilities were revolutionary. They could plan complex hunts weeks in advance. They could develop agricultural strategies based on multi-year predictions about rainfall and seasons. They could create technologies requiring multiple stages of preparation and assembly, because they could mentally represent each stage linguistically and coordinate the entire process. Most importantly, they could teach. Not just by demonstration, which chimpanzees can do, but by explanation. A master toolmaker could describe not just how to strike the stone, but why you strike it at that angle, what you're trying to achieve, how to adjust your technique when the stone quality varies. This made cultural evolution possible. Knowledge could accumulate across generations faster than genes could evolve. Each generation could build on the innovations of the previous generation because language allowed precise transmission of complex information. And all of this, every bit of it, required the physical restructuring of the human brain, the enlargement of Broca's and Wernicke's areas, the development of dense neural connections between language centers and other cognitive systems, the enhancement of the mirror neuron network, the creation of new forms of neural synchronization to handle syntax processing. Language didn't just change what we could do, it changed what we were, transformed our brains from slightly improved primate organs into something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. A neural architecture capable of abstract reasoning, recursive planning, social coordination at massive scales, and most importantly, continuous self-improvement through cultural evolution. We became the first species that could consciously redesign itself, not through genetic evolution, which takes hundreds of thousands of years, but through cultural innovation, which could happen in a single generation. And it all started with words, simple sounds carrying meaning. But once those sounds began reshaping our brains, there was no turning back. We had created a cognitive feedback loop that would eventually take us from small bands of survivors to a species that dominates the entire planet. But language alone wasn't enough. The brain hardware was necessary, but it wasn't sufficient. Something else had to happen to trigger the explosion, and that something was about to arrive. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Because even if our ancestors had the genetic mutations, even if their brains were physically capable of complex language, none of that would matter without one crucial ingredient: people. Lots of people. Close enough together to actually talk to each other. This is the part that most explanations of language evolution completely miss. You can have the perfect genetic toolkit for language, the ideal brain structure, all the neural machinery needed for complex communication. But if you're living in groups of 15 people separated by hundreds of miles from the next group, complex language is basically useless. It's like having the world's most powerful computer in a cave with no electricity. The hardware is there, but the conditions for using it don't exist. Enter the population threshold theory. And this is where the numbers get really fascinating. Anthropologists have calculated that for complex language to emerge and be maintained, you need a critical mass of speakers, not just a few dozen people, not even a few hundred. You need populations dense enough that individuals regularly interact with hundreds or thousands of other speakers over their lifetime. Why? Because language isn't just about communication, it's about information storage and transmission. Every individual speaker in your population is carrying a library of knowledge in their head, words for plants and animals, names for places and people, stories about past events, techniques for making tools and finding food. The more speakers you have in regular contact, the larger your collective library becomes. Think of it like this. You're part of a group of 20 people living in relative isolation. Your language might have a few hundred words, names for familiar animals and plants, terms for basic activities like hunting, eating, sleeping. Simple descriptions of your immediate environment. That's enough for survival, but it's not enough for cultural accumulation. Now imagine your population grows. Different groups start coming into more regular contact. Trade networks form. Marriage exchanges between groups become more common. Suddenly, instead of interacting with the same 20 people your entire life, you're meeting dozens or hundreds of different individuals. Each one brings their own knowledge, their own words, their own innovations. Your vocabulary explodes. You need words to describe things from different territories, terms for new technologies you encounter through trade, abstract concepts to negotiate complex social relationships with people you don't know intimately. Language becomes not just a tool for coordinating daily activities, but a repository for storing and transmitting increasingly complex information. The archaeological evidence for this population growth coincides perfectly with the Great Leap Forward. Around 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, modern human populations in Africa show evidence of significant expansion. Not just more people, but people living in larger, more interconnected communities. And that's exactly when we see the explosion of cultural complexity in the archaeological record. But population density alone isn't enough. You also need cultural transmission, the ability to pass information accurately from one person to another, and more importantly from one generation to the next. And this is where language becomes absolutely revolutionary. Before complex language, our ancestors learned primarily through observation and imitation. You watched your parents make tools and you tried to copy their movements. You saw how they tracked animals and you followed their example. This works, but it's incredibly slow and error-prone. Each generation has to rediscover techniques through trial and error. Knowledge gets lost or corrupted constantly. With language, everything changes. Now you can teach explicitly. You can say, when you strike the stone at this angle, it produces a sharper edge. You can explain why certain techniques work. You can describe hunting strategies before you attempt them. Most importantly, you can correct mistakes in real time. No, not like that. Hold it this way, strike here, not there. This is the teaching revolution, and it's completely unique to humans with complex language. No other species can do this. Chimpanzees can learn from each other through observation. Dolphins can transmit foraging techniques culturally, but they can't explain. They can't break down complex procedures into explicit steps. They can't tell you what they're thinking when they perform an action. Language transforms teaching from passive observation into active instruction, and the speed of cultural transmission increases exponentially. A skill that might take months or years to learn through trial and error can be taught in hours or days with explicit instruction. A technique that might be discovered once and then lost when the innovator dies can be preserved indefinitely through verbal description and teaching. This creates what anthropologists call cumulative culture. Each generation doesn't start from zero. They start with everything their parents knew, plus whatever new innovations they can add. Knowledge accumulates like compound interest. Each generation builds on the last, and the rate of cultural evolution accelerates. The evidence for this is stark. Populations with complex language show continuous technological improvement in the archaeological record. Tools become more sophisticated. New materials are incorporated. Designs become standardized and then improved. It's a clear trajectory of accumulation and refinement. Populations without complex language show what anthropologists call cultural loss. Their technology actually becomes simpler over time. Techniques get forgotten. Tools become cruder. This isn't because these populations are less intelligent. It's because without language to explicitly preserve and transmit knowledge, complex information is constantly being lost. The most dramatic example comes from Tasmania. When rising sea levels isolated Tasmania from mainland Australia about 12,000 years ago, the indigenous Tasmanian population numbered only a few thousand. Too small and too isolated to maintain the full complexity of Aboriginal Australian culture. Over millennia, their technology actually became simpler. They lost bone tools, complex spear-throwing technology, even the knowledge of how to make fire in certain ways. Not because they forgot how to think, but because with such a small population and no outside contact, complex knowledge was being lost faster than it could be transmitted and preserved. The same pattern shows up everywhere anthropologists look. Islands with small isolated populations consistently show technological simplification. Large interconnected populations show technological elaboration. The difference isn't genetic. It's not about intelligence or capability. It's about numbers and connections. It's about having enough people in regular communication to maintain and build upon complex cultural knowledge. And this is where we need to talk about memes, not internet memes, though the concept is related. The original meme theory, proposed by Richard Dawkins, describes how ideas themselves can act as replicators. Just like genes replicate and evolve through natural selection, ideas replicate and evolve through cultural transmission. A good idea, a useful technique, a catchy story, these things spread from mind to mind. They get copied, sometimes perfectly, sometimes with variations. The variations that are most memorable, most useful, or most appealing spread further. The ones that are confusing or useless die out. Without language, meme transmission is slow and limited. You can transmit simple ideas through imitation, crude gestures, emotional expressions, but complex ideas, abstract concepts, detailed procedures, these are nearly impossible to transmit accurately without words. Language turns human brains into meme replication machines. Now ideas can spread with incredible fidelity and speed. A technique discovered in one part of your territory can be explained in detail and transmitted to groups hundreds of miles away. A story told in one generation can be memorized and passed down for dozens of generations. A new word for a useful concept can spread through an entire population in years. This creates what biologists call a dual inheritance system. We're not just evolving genetically anymore. We're also evolving culturally. And cultural evolution is vastly faster than genetic evolution. Genes take thousands of generations to produce significant changes. Memes can produce radical cultural transformation in a single generation. Think about the difference between biological evolution and cultural evolution in terms of tool use. For millions of years, our ancestors used basically the same stone tool technology, simple choppers and hand axes. Why? Because tool use was primarily learned through imitation. Each generation rediscovered techniques by watching and copying. Innovation was rare and difficult to preserve. Improvement was glacially slow. Then language emerges. Suddenly you can teach tool making explicitly. You can describe techniques in detail. You can explain the reasoning behind design choices. You can critique and improve on existing methods through discussion and experimentation. Within just a few thousand years, stone tool technology goes from basic choppers to sophisticated blade production, specialized scrapers, precisely hafted spear points. The rate of innovation is hundreds of times faster than the previous millions of years, not because brains changed, but because cultural transmission became exponentially more efficient. And this creates the ratchet effect. Each generation doesn't just maintain previous innovations, they build on them. Your parents taught you everything they knew, plus you figured out a few improvements. You teach your children everything you know, including your improvements, plus they figure out a few more innovations. Click by click, ratchet step by ratchet step, technology and knowledge accumulate. This is absolutely unique to humans. Chimpanzees don't show the ratchet effect. Neither do any other species. Individual chimps sometimes innovate, discovering new techniques for cracking nuts or fishing for termites. These innovations can spread culturally through observation, but they don't accumulate. Chimp tool use today is essentially identical to chimp tool use 100,000 years ago. No improvement, no elaboration, no building on previous innovations. Why? Because without language, there's no way to explicitly teach the reasoning behind techniques, no way to discuss improvements, no way to preserve complex procedures across generations with enough fidelity that each generation can refine and improve them. Chimps are stuck at the level of simple imitation. They can copy what they see, but they can't build on it systematically. Humans with language break through this limitation completely. We don't just copy, we improve. We don't just maintain, we elaborate. We don't just preserve, we transform. The ratchet effect allows cumulative culture. And cumulative culture allows everything that makes us human. Technology, art, science, literature, all of it depends on our ability to build on previous generations' knowledge. But here's the really wild part. The ratchet effect doesn't just apply to physical technology. It applies to ideas, social systems, even language itself. Once you have basic language, you can use it to develop more sophisticated language. You can invent new words for new concepts. You can create abstract terms for things that don't physically exist. You can develop grammatical structures that allow increasingly complex thoughts to be expressed. Language evolves through use, becoming more powerful and more flexible with each generation. This creates a positive feedback loop. Better language allows more complex ideas. More complex ideas require more sophisticated language. The cycle accelerates, driving language and thought to levels of complexity impossible to achieve through genetic evolution alone. The archaeological evidence shows this clearly. Early modern humans, even with the genetic and neural capacity for language, produced relatively simple material culture. Then around 50,000 years ago, boom, explosion of complexity, sophisticated tools, art, jewelry, long-distance trade networks, all appearing relatively suddenly in the archaeological record. What changed? Not genes. The genetic capacity was already there. What changed was population density and social complexity. Enough people living in close enough proximity with developed enough language to trigger the ratchet effect. Once that threshold was crossed, cumulative culture kicked in and ran away with itself. Each generation building on the last, innovation accelerating, complexity snowballing. And once it started, there was no stopping it. Groups with more sophisticated language and more complex cumulative culture could support larger populations. Larger populations allowed even more specialization and innovation. More innovation created more complex culture. The feedback loop became self-reinforcing, driving human cultural evolution to levels unprecedented in the natural world. This is why population density mattered so much, not just because you need people to talk to, but because cultural evolution requires critical mass. Too few people, too isolated, and knowledge is lost faster than it accumulates. Enough people, connected enough, and you get the ratchet effect. You get cumulative culture. You get the explosion of human capability that transformed our species from clever apes into the dominant force on the planet. We are the only species that has ever achieved this. The only species where culture evolves faster than biology. The only species where each generation knows vastly more than the one before it. The only species where knowledge compounds across centuries and millennia, building layer upon layer until we can split atoms and leave footprints on the moon. And it all comes down to language. Not just the ability to communicate, but the ability to teach, to preserve, to build upon previous knowledge. Language turned us from individual learners into a collective intelligence. Each human brain became a node in a vast network of cultural knowledge, and that network, growing denser and more complex with each passing generation, became the foundation for everything we call civilization. But language didn't just transform our culture. It transformed something even more fundamental. It transformed consciousness itself. But here's where things get really strange, really profound. Because language didn't just give us a better way to communicate with each other. It fundamentally changed what was happening inside our heads. It rewired consciousness itself. Think about your internal experience right now. As you're watching this, there's probably a voice in your head. Maybe it's commenting on what I'm saying. Maybe it's making a grocery list or replaying an awkward conversation from yesterday. That voice, that constant stream of internal monologue, feels so natural that you probably assume it's just what consciousness is, that it's always been there. But here's the thing, it hasn't. That voice in your head isn't consciousness. It's language operating on consciousness. And before language exploded 50,000 years ago, that voice didn't exist. Your ancestors' internal experience was fundamentally different from yours. Not less rich, necessarily, but structured in a completely different way. This is where we hit one of the most controversial questions in cognitive science. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, named after linguists Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf, who proposed it in the early 20th century. The strong version of this hypothesis claims that language doesn't just express our thoughts, it determines them. That the specific language you speak actually shapes what you can think, what you can perceive, what you can understand. The weak version, which most scientists now accept, suggests that language influences thought without completely determining it, that the words and grammatical structures available to you make certain kinds of thinking easier or harder, more natural or more difficult. And the evidence for even this weaker version is staggering. Consider the Piraha people of the Amazon, who have a language with no number words beyond 1, 2, and many. When researchers test their ability to match quantities, they can do it perfectly for 1 or 2 items. But beyond that, they struggle with tasks that seem trivially easy to people who speak languages with extensive number systems. Not because they're less intelligent, but because their language doesn't provide the cognitive scaffolding for thinking about exact quantities above 2. Or consider languages that have different color terms than English. Russian has separate words for light blue and dark blue, not just a single word blue with modifiers. And Russian speakers are measurably faster at distinguishing these shades than English speakers. Their language has created perceptual categories that make certain visual distinctions more automatic, more natural. But these are relatively simple examples. The really profound implications emerge when we consider how language shapes our ability to think about things that have no physical existence at all. Abstract concepts, hypothetical scenarios, time, consciousness itself. Because here's what language gave us that we didn't have before: the ability to talk to ourselves. And when we talk to ourselves, we think differently. Neuroscience research over the last few decades has revealed something extraordinary. When you engage in verbal thinking, in that internal monologue, your brain activates the same regions involved in actual speech. Your motor cortex, the part that controls your tongue and vocal cords, shows activity even though you're not speaking out loud. It's called inner speech, and it's not just thinking, it's sub-vocalized language. Studies of people with language impairment show that damage to language centers doesn't just affect communication, it affects thinking itself. Patients with severe aphasia who've lost the ability to produce or comprehend language often report that their internal experience has changed fundamentally. The voice in their head goes quiet. Their thoughts become less verbal, more imagistic, harder to control. This suggests something radical. That voice in your head, that internal narrator, isn't just reporting your thoughts, it's part of the machinery that generates them. And this machinery enables something that might be unique to language-using species: metacognition. Thinking about thinking. Right now, you can not only have thoughts, you can observe yourself having them. You can evaluate whether your reasoning is sound. You can notice that you're anxious and ask yourself why. You can plan how you'll think about a problem tomorrow. This is metacognition, and it seems to require language. Watch a dog trying to solve a problem. Maybe there's food on the other side of a fence, and the dog keeps trying to push through directly even though there's an obvious gap just a few feet away. The dog can think, can try different strategies, but it can't step back and think about its own thinking, can't observe its problem-solving process and say, wait, this approach isn't working, let me reconsider. Language gives us that ability, because when you verbalize your thoughts, even internally, you externalize them. You turn them into objects that can be examined. I think X becomes a proposition that can be evaluated, questioned, revised. The words create distance between the thinker and the thought. Before language, your ancestors probably experienced something closer to what we might call flow, immediate response to the environment. Emotion and perception and action all merge together without the separation that language creates. Not unconscious, but conscious in a fundamentally different way. Consciousness without commentary. Experience without narrative. Then language arrived, and suddenly minds could watch themselves think. But perhaps the most profound change language brought was the ability to mentally time travel, to consciously project yourself forward into the future or backward into the past with extraordinary precision. Now, other animals show some rudimentary time sense. Squirrels bury nuts for winter. Birds migrate south before the cold arrives. But this seems to be instinctual, automatic. They're not imagining themselves in the future, wondering what it will feel like to be hungry, consciously planning for that future self. Language changes everything because language has tense. Past, present, future. These aren't just grammatical features, they're cognitive technologies that allow you to mentally position yourself at different points in time. When you say, I will do this tomorrow, you're not just planning. You're imagining a future self, modeling what that self will experience, what challenges that self will face. You're splitting your consciousness across time. When you say, I should have done that differently, you're not just remembering. You're reimagining the past, running counterfactual simulations, comparing what happened to what might have happened. This is more than memory. Lots of animals have memory. This is episodic prospection and retrospection, the ability to mentally simulate past and future experiences from a first-person perspective, to not just recall facts, but to re-experience past moments and pre-experience future ones. And this ability seems to be intimately connected to language. Studies of people with amnesia show that damage to language processing areas often impairs not just past memory but future imagination. If you can't linguistically structure time, you can't mentally travel through it. The archaeological evidence suggests our ancestors developed this ability right around the behavioral revolution 50,000 years ago. Suddenly we see evidence of long-term planning that would require detailed mental simulation of future scenarios. We see ritual burial that suggests people were thinking about death, about their own future non-existence. We see seasonal camps that indicate groups were planning their movements months in advance, based on expected resource availability. This is consciousness that extends beyond the immediate present, minds that can simultaneously exist in multiple time frames, and it's language that makes it possible. But language did something else equally profound. It gave us theory of mind, the ability to model what other people are thinking. Now, some other primates show rudimentary theory of mind. Chimps understand that others have goals and can see things they can't see. But human theory of mind goes far deeper. You don't just know that I have thoughts. You can model the specific content of those thoughts, predict what I'm likely to think in response to new information, even imagine how I'm feeling right now as you watch this. You can hold complex nested mental models. He thinks that she believes that they want multiple layers of embedded intentionality, tracking what different people know and believe and want, all simultaneously. And this extraordinary ability seems to depend on language, specifically on grammatical structures that allow embedded clauses. I know that you think that she believes. These linguistic structures create templates for nested mental modeling. Children typically develop sophisticated theory of mind right around the time they master complex grammar, usually between ages 3 and 5, and studies of deaf children who weren't exposed to sign language early show delayed theory of mind development. Without linguistic structures to organize social cognition, modeling other minds becomes much harder. Before language, your ancestors probably understood that others had intentions and perceptions, but they likely couldn't model those minds with the precision and depth that language enables. They lived in smaller social groups, partly because managing relationships in large groups requires tracking dozens of complex social models simultaneously. Who knows what? Who believes what? Who wants what? Who's allied with whom? Language gave us the cognitive technology to scale up social complexity, to live in groups of hundreds, eventually thousands, by maintaining elaborate mental models of social relationships. But perhaps the most radical change language brought was the emergence of what philosophers call the narrative self, the sense that you're not just a conscious being, but a specific individual with a continuous identity that persists through time. Who are you? Not just your name, but who you are. If you think about it for a moment, the answer that comes to mind is probably a story, a narrative about where you came from, what you've experienced, what you care about, what you're trying to become. You are, in a very real sense, the story you tell yourself about yourself, and that story is made of language. Neuroscience shows that the sense of self activates language centers in the brain. When people think about their own identity, about who they are as individuals, their language processing regions light up. Self-concept isn't just thought, it's linguistic thought. Studies of people with severe language impairments suggest that their sense of continuous personal identity becomes fragmented. Without the narrative thread that language provides, without the ability to tell themselves the story of who they are, their selfhood becomes less coherent, less stable. This suggests something profound and a little unsettling. The person you think you are, that continuous identity that feels so fundamental to your existence, is a construction. A story your brain tells itself using linguistic structures. And before language, that kind of self probably didn't exist. Your ancestors 100,000 years ago were conscious. They felt pain and pleasure, fear and joy. They perceived the world and responded to it. But they probably didn't have that strong sense of being a particular individual with a life story, with a past that explained their present and a future they were working toward. That narrative self is something language created. And here's where we get to the really mind-bending possibility. That consciousness itself, at least the kind of reflexive self-aware consciousness that feels unique to humans, emerged when language allowed us to describe our own internal experiences. There's a theory, controversial but increasingly supported by evidence, that consciousness woke up when we developed the linguistic tools to talk about it. That before language, our ancestors experienced the world but couldn't describe those experiences to themselves, couldn't categorize their emotions, couldn't name their thoughts, couldn't step back and observe their own mental states. They felt fear, but couldn't think, "I am afraid." They perceived colours, but couldn't think, "That is red." They had mental images, but couldn't distinguish between memory and imagination, between perception and hallucination, because they lacked the linguistic categories to make those distinctions. Then language arrived, and suddenly minds could label their own contents, could distinguish between "I see" and "I imagine," between "I remember" and "I dream," between "I think" and "I know." This labeling didn't just describe consciousness, it organized it, structured it, made it possible to control and direct attention in ways that weren't possible before. When you can think, "I need to focus on this," you can manage your own attention. When you can think, "That's just anxiety talking," you can evaluate your own emotional states. When you can think, "I'm thinking about this wrong," you can deliberately shift cognitive strategies. Language gave us executive control over our own minds, turned consciousness from something we experienced into something we could observe, manage, and deliberately modify. And this might explain why the behavioral revolution happened when it did. Not because brains suddenly got bigger. They'd been large for hundreds of thousands of years. Not because some new gene emerged. The genetic capacity was already there. But because language reached a threshold of complexity where it could do something unprecedented. It could describe consciousness to itself, could create internal models of internal experience, could turn minds into objects of their own attention. When that happened, around 50,000 years ago, minds woke up. Not into consciousness, they'd been conscious all along, but into self-awareness, into the ability to observe and direct their own mental processes, into the recursive loop of language thinking about thought, thinking about language. Your ancestors around this time began decorating their bodies, creating art, performing rituals. And these weren't just cultural activities, they were external expressions of newly articulated internal experiences. The ochre they painted on cave walls was the colour they could finally name. The figurines they carved were the mental images they could finally distinguish from memories. The rituals they performed were the emotions they could finally categorize and share. The explosion of symbolic culture wasn't just communication between people, it was consciousness communicating with itself. Internal experience finally becoming expressible, shareable, buildable upon. And once that feedback loop started, once language began shaping thought and thought began expanding language, there was no stopping it. Each generation could describe their experiences more precisely than the last, could think thoughts their parents couldn't have imagined because they now had words for concepts that previously existed only as vague feelings or intuitions. Within a few thousand years, human consciousness had transformed from something probably similar to what other great apes experience into something qualitatively different. A mind that could observe itself, question itself, deliberately reshape itself through internal dialogue. We became the only species whose consciousness includes consciousness itself as an object of attention. Who can think about thinking? Who can feel emotions while simultaneously observing and analyzing those emotions? Who can experience experience? And it all traces back to that moment when language became sophisticated enough to describe what was happening inside our heads. When the operating system achieved self-awareness, when minds developed the ability to read and edit their own source code, the consequences of that transformation would reshape everything, not just how we thought, but what we could build, what we could imagine, what we could become. Because once you can think about thinking, once you can mentally time travel and model other minds and construct narrative selves, you're not just responding to the world anymore. You're creating it, imagining possibilities that don't exist and then making them real. And that's exactly what happened next. But language didn't just help humans communicate better. It didn't just let them share information about where the good hunting was or which plants were poisonous. Language did something far more profound, something that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of human civilization. It created a new kind of reality, one that existed entirely in the realm of shared imagination. Think about what language actually allows you to do. You can talk about things that aren't physically present. A lion that attacked your cousin 3 valleys away last month. A storm that's coming tomorrow. The spirit of your great-grandfather who died before you were born. None of these things exist in the immediate physical environment, but language makes them real, makes them part of your decision-making process, part of your social reality. Now scale that up. Once humans could use language to create shared fictions, shared beliefs about things that existed only in collective imagination, everything changed. Because here's the thing about other social animals. Chimpanzees can cooperate in groups of maybe 50 individuals, all of whom know each other personally. Wolves can form packs of a dozen. Elephants maintain family groups of 20 or 30. But humans? Once we had sophisticated language, we could cooperate in groups of thousands, eventually millions, with people we'd never meet. All because we could believe in the same stories. This is the secret weapon that allowed modern humans to outcompete every other human species. Not bigger brains, not stronger bodies, not even better tools, though those helped. It was the ability to create and maintain shared myths that bound large groups together. Myths about tribal identity, about sacred places, about ancestors and spirits and the order of the world. Neanderthals probably had some capacity for symbolic thinking. The burial practices prove that. But modern humans took it further. They created entire cosmologies, complex stories about how the world worked and humanity's place in it. Stories that could unite hundreds of people who'd never met, creating cooperation networks that no other species could match. The archaeological evidence for this appears suddenly in the record around 50,000 years ago. Not just better tools, but art. cave paintings that clearly depict hunts, animals, human figures, carved figurines that seem to represent fertility goddesses or ancestral spirits, beads and ornaments that indicate status hierarchies and group identity. These aren't survival tools, these are symbols, physical manifestations of shared stories and beliefs. And those shared stories had practical consequences. Imagine two human groups encountering each other in unfamiliar territory. Without shared language and myths, they're competitors. Maybe they fight. Maybe they avoid each other. Resource conflict is almost inevitable. But with language, they can discover they worship the same ancestral spirits. They can recognize each other's tribal symbols. They can tell stories about common origins that make them kin, even if they've never met before. Suddenly, instead of competitors, they're potential allies. They can trade, intermarry, share information about resources and dangers. Language created the possibility of cooperation between strangers, and that changed everything. This linguistic superpower is what allowed modern humans to spread across the entire planet in just 40,000 years. When modern humans left Africa around 60,000 years ago, they didn't just walk into empty territory. They entered lands occupied by Neanderthals, Denisovans, and probably other human species we haven't discovered yet. All of these species had been adapting to their environments for hundreds of thousands of years. All of them should have had home field advantage, but modern humans swept across the world like a wildfire, reaching Australia by 50,000 years ago, Europe by 45,000 years ago, the Americas by 15,000 years ago. No other large mammal has ever colonized so many different environments so quickly. And the key was language-enabled cooperation. A group of 30 modern humans wasn't just 30 individuals. Through shared language and beliefs, they were connected to dozens of other groups across vast territories. They could call on allies, trade for resources they didn't have locally, share innovations and technologies across hundreds or thousands of miles. They were part of a network. And networks beat even the toughest individuals every single time. Then about 12,000 years ago, language enabled something even more revolutionary, agriculture. Now you might think farming is simple, put seeds in ground, water them, harvest crops. What does that have to do with language? Everything. Because agriculture isn't just about knowing how to plant seeds. It's about coordinating complex activities across seasons, maintaining property boundaries, planning for the future, and most critically, cooperating with people you might not even like. Hunter-gatherer societies could operate with relatively simple language. You need words for animals, plants, directions, immediate dangers. Social relationships are mostly face-to-face with people you've known your whole life. But agriculture requires something completely different. You need to be able to discuss abstract concepts like ownership. This field belongs to my family, that field belongs to yours, and we all agree to respect those boundaries even when the other person isn't watching. That's a fiction, a shared story maintained purely through language. There's nothing in the physical world that makes one plot of land belong to anyone. But if everyone believes the story and agrees to act as if it's true, it becomes functionally real. You also need to coordinate activities across time. Planting happens in spring, harvest in fall, storage for winter, planning for next year's crop, trade surpluses with neighbouring villages. All of this requires the ability to talk about things that haven't happened yet, to make agreements that extend months into the future, to maintain social contracts with dozens or hundreds of people simultaneously. Without sophisticated language, none of it works. You can't run a farming village with the communication abilities of chimpanzees. The system collapses immediately. and agriculture enabled by language created a positive feedback loop that transformed human civilization. Farming settlements could support much larger populations than hunter-gatherer bands. Larger populations meant more specialization. Not everyone had to spend all their time getting food. Some people could become craftspeople, toolmakers, priests, warriors. Each specialization developed its own specialized vocabulary, its own way of talking about its domain of expertise. Language became more complex, which enabled more coordination, which enabled larger societies, which required even more sophisticated language. Round and round the cycle went, accelerating with each generation. By 5,000 years ago, this process had created something unprecedented. Cities, actual urban centers with tens of thousands of people living in close proximity, most of whom were strangers to each other. This should have been impossible. Every other primate becomes more aggressive and stressed in high-density populations. Put too many chimps in too small a space and they tear each other apart. But humans created legal systems, religious hierarchies, economic structures, all maintained through increasingly complex language that allowed strangers to cooperate. The Sumerians in Mesopotamia, the Egyptians along the Nile, the Indus Valley civilization, all of them held together by shared stories about divine kings, legal codes, property rights, and social obligations. Stories that existed only because humans could articulate them in language. Then language did something even more extraordinary. It externalized itself. Writing. This might seem like a simple extension of speaking, but it's not. Writing is language that persists outside of any individual mind. It's thought captured in physical form, ideas that can outlive their creators by centuries or millennia. The first writing systems appeared around 5,200 years ago, and they weren't created for poetry or stories. They were invented for accounting. Sumerian merchants needed to track who owed what to whom, how many sheep belonged to which temple, how much grain was stored in which warehouse. Spoken language wasn't enough anymore. Societies had become too complex. There were too many transactions, too many agreements, too many details to hold in individual memories, even collective memories. So humans invented ways to make language visible, permanent, transferable across space and time. And once you have writing, everything accelerates again. Knowledge doesn't have to be passed down through oral tradition anymore. With all the distortion and loss that entails, it can be recorded precisely, studied, built upon. A scholar in ancient Alexandria could read texts written by Sumerian priests 1,000 years earlier and build on their ideas. That's a completely new phenomenon in natural history. It's the beginning of cumulative cultural evolution at scales and speeds that biology alone could never achieve. Writing enabled law codes that were too complex to memorize, religious texts that could be standardized across vast empires, scientific treatises that could record observations and experiments for future generations, mathematical notation that could capture relationships too complex for words alone. Each of these specialized languages, law, religion, science, mathematics, emerged because writing allowed language to escape the limitations of human memory and face-to-face communication. And some of these specialized languages transformed how humans understood reality itself. Mathematics is just a very precise language for describing patterns and relationships. But once you have that language, you can describe things that ordinary words can't capture. The motion of planets, the properties of triangles, the relationships between numbers themselves. Greek mathematicians could prove truths that were eternal and universal, not dependent on any particular culture or time period. That's profound. They had created a language that could describe reality with perfect precision. Science emerged when humans combined mathematical language with systematic observation and experimentation. Galileo didn't just look at falling objects and swinging pendulums. He developed a mathematical language to describe their motion, equations that captured universal laws. Newton took that language and used it to describe gravity, planetary motion, the behavior of light. Einstein extended it to describe space, time, and the relationship between matter and energy. Each advance required not just observation, but the development of more sophisticated languages to articulate what was being discovered. Here's the really mind-bending part. These specialized languages revealed aspects of reality that human brains never evolved to perceive directly. We can't see atoms, but we can describe them mathematically and predict their behavior. We can't experience four-dimensional space-time, but we can write equations that describe it and make testable predictions. Language, especially mathematical language, became a tool for accessing realities that lie completely outside human sensory experience. We use language to escape the limitations of our own perception, but not everyone benefited equally from this linguistic revolution. And that pattern started early and continues today. In ancient civilizations, literacy was restricted to tiny elites, scribes, priests, royal administrators. Everyone else was excluded from the world of written knowledge. Legal codes they couldn't read governed their lives. Religious texts they couldn't access defined their spiritual options. Economic contracts they couldn't comprehend bound their labor. Language inequality became a primary mechanism of social control. This pattern persists. Even today, in our supposedly educated age, access to specialized languages determines life outcomes. If you never learn mathematical language beyond basic arithmetic, entire fields are closed to you. Engineering, computer science, economics, physics. If you don't master the formal language of academic writing, higher education becomes nearly impossible. If you can't navigate legal language, you're at the mercy of those who can. Language inequality isn't just about whether you can communicate, it's about which realities you can access, which social spaces you can enter, which forms of power you can wield. And we're in the middle of another linguistic revolution right now, one that might be as profound as the original emergence of language 50,000 years ago. Digital communication. For 50,000 years, language was limited by distance and time. You could only talk to people within earshot. Writing extended that range, but slowly. A letter might take weeks to travel between cities, months to cross continents. Ideas could spread, but gradually through laborious copying and physical transport of texts. Then, in the span of a single human lifetime, from roughly 1900 to 2000, we demolished those constraints entirely. Telegraph, telephone, radio, television, and finally the internet created the possibility of instant communication across any distance. Someone in Tokyo can have a real-time conversation with someone in New York. A video can be posted in Mumbai and viewed by millions of people around the world within hours. Language has become essentially instantaneous and global. This is rewiring human social organization in ways we're only beginning to understand. Remember, the original language explosion enabled cooperation between strangers through shared myths and stories. Digital communication is doing the same thing, but at planetary scale. People who will never meet face-to-face can organize movements, coordinate actions, develop shared identities and beliefs. Political revolutions start with hashtags. Scientific collaborations span continents. Cultural phenomena emerge and spread globally in days. We're creating new forms of collective consciousness that would have been impossible even 30 years ago. But we're also seeing the dark side of language at scale. Misinformation spreads just as fast as truth. Tribal identities form around online communities, creating new forms of in-group versus out-group conflict. The same tool that enables global cooperation enables global manipulation. Because language, remember, doesn't just communicate truth. It creates shared realities. And when those realities conflict, when different groups believe fundamentally incompatible stories about how the world works, cooperation breaks down. We're experiencing that tension right now, living through another phase transition in how human language shapes collective behavior. And then there's artificial intelligence. Language models that can generate human-like text, translate between languages, answer questions, even write code. This is genuinely unprecedented. For 50,000 years, language was exclusively a human capability. Now we've created machines that can manipulate linguistic symbols with stunning sophistication. They don't understand language the way humans do. They're not conscious. But they can perform linguistic tasks that were impossible for any non-human entity just a decade ago. What does this tell us about language itself? Maybe that it's more mechanical than we thought, more about pattern recognition and statistical relationships than some mystical human essence. The fact that silicon circuits can learn to use language by analyzing patterns in text suggests language is, at its core, a system of rules and regularities, incredibly complex but not magical. This is humbling and fascinating in equal measure, and it raises profound questions about the future. If machines can use language, even without consciousness or understanding, what does that mean for human uniqueness? For 50,000 years, language was our superpower, the thing that made us different from every other species. If we can give that power to artificial systems, what happens next? Do we create new forms of intelligence that can communicate with each other in ways we can't follow? Do we augment human linguistic abilities with digital tools, creating hybrid forms of communication? Do we eventually discover that consciousness itself emerges from linguistic complexity? That sufficiently sophisticated language-using systems inevitably become self-aware? We don't know. We're standing at the edge of another explosion, another moment when the rules of language and communication are being fundamentally rewritten. Just like 50,000 years ago, we're living through a transition that will determine what humans become next. Understanding that original explosion, how language emerged and transformed our species, isn't just interesting history. It's a guide to understanding what's happening right now. The same forces that allowed a small population of African humans to dominate the planet, cooperation at scale through shared linguistic realities, are now operating at global digital speeds. The same dynamics that eliminated Neanderthals, not through violence but through out-competition, enabled by better communication and coordination, are playing out between different human groups today, between those who master new forms of language and those who don't, between humans and the artificial systems we're creating. This is why the language explosion 50,000 years ago matters, not because it's ancient history, but because it's current events. The moment minds woke up wasn't a one-time occurrence. It's a process that's still unfolding. Language created modern humanity, and language is creating whatever comes next. We're not just observers of this process. We're participants, active agents in the next phase of linguistic evolution. The question isn't whether language will continue transforming human civilization. It will. The question is whether we'll shape that transformation consciously, or whether we'll be shaped by it without understanding what's happening. That original explosion 50,000 years ago gave us the power to speak, to think in symbols, to create shared realities. This explosion, the one we're living through right now, is giving us the power to speak to everyone, instantly, globally, with tools that amplify both our wisdom and our foolishness. What we do with that power will determine whether the language revolution that created modern humanity will ultimately save us or destroy us. The minds that woke up 50,000 years ago are facing their greatest test yet, and the next chapter of the story is being written right now, in every conversation, every text, every idea shared across the digital networks that connect all of humanity in ways our ancestors could never have imagined. So, here we are, the end of a journey that started 50,000 years ago when something extraordinary happened inside human minds, when language exploded, when consciousness itself transformed, when silent, brilliant humans suddenly gained the ability to speak their thoughts into existence and changed everything forever. Think about what we've covered. Before that moment, humans were anatomically modern for 200,000 years. Sophisticated brains, capable hands, social groups. But something was missing. The archaeological record was almost silent. Simple tools, basic survival, no art, no symbols, no evidence of the rich inner life we take for granted today. Then, around 50,000 years ago, everything changed at once. Cave paintings appeared, sophisticated tools proliferated, trade networks exploded across continents, symbolic thinking erupted everywhere humans lived, and the difference, the thing that unlocked all of it, was language, not just communication. Animals communicate, but language as a cognitive technology, a tool for thinking itself. When humans gained the ability to attach arbitrary sounds to abstract concepts, they gained the ability to think in completely new ways, to plan elaborate futures, to reflect on their own thoughts, to share complex knowledge across generations, to build mental models of reality that existed nowhere except in language itself. Here's what's truly wild about this. Language didn't just describe consciousness. It created new forms of consciousness. Before language, human awareness was probably locked in the present moment, rich, vivid, but immediate. After language, humans could mentally time travel. They could be physically present in one place while thinking about the past or imagining the future. They could hold conversations with people who weren't there. They could conceive of abstract entities like gods, justice, and mathematics. Language gave humans the operating system for symbolic thought, and symbolic thought gave humans the ability to dominate the planet. We are still living in the ripples of that moment. Every word you're hearing right now connects you directly to that original cognitive revolution 50,000 years ago. Every sentence you speak uses neural pathways that were carved by thousands of generations learning to think in language. Every abstract concept you understand exists only because humans learn to encode reality in arbitrary sounds and symbols. Your ability to watch this video and understand these ideas, that's not natural. That's the product of the most dramatic cognitive transformation in Earth's history. You're using cognitive tools that were forged when minds first woke up. But here's the really exciting part. We might not be done. Right now, in our lifetime, we're developing new technologies that could fundamentally change how minds communicate. Brain-computer interfaces, artificial intelligence, neural networks that can generate language without consciousness. We're standing at the edge of what could be another cognitive revolution. A moment when the way humans think and communicate transforms as dramatically as it did 50,000 years ago. So if you found this journey fascinating, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and whether you think we're headed for another cognitive leap. And subscribe, because the story of how minds work and how they're changing is far from over. Every word we speak connects us to that first moment of awakening. The question is, what comes next?